Okay, let's unpack this. When we talk about autism, a term you've probably heard is context blindness. It sort of suggests this fundamental inability to grasp unspoken cues. But what if? What if what we've always labeled as a blindness was actually maybe a different kind of vision? Today, we're diving deep into context blindness as it relates to autism. We'll explore why this term exists, how it's traditionally defined, and crucially, whose perspective it truly reflects. This deep dive is going to challenge some really ingrained assumptions, I think.
That's right. For this deep dive, we're drawing heavily from a really powerful piece by Jaime Hoerricks, a PhD. It's called Autism and Context Blindness. Maybe you're just not that interesting. And we're also looking at various research papers she critically examines. Our mission really is to truly understand if context blindness accurately describes autistic cognition, or, if it reveals more about neurotypical communication itself. We'll trace its historical roots, look critically at research methodologies, explore the societal impact of these labels. All of this to give you a shortcut to being genuinely well-informed on what's, frankly, a fascinating and complex topic.
So let's start with the prevailing narrative, the one many of us are probably most familiar with. Context blindness. It's often presented as an autistic person's lack of intuitive ability to use context. It's painted as if autistic individuals consistently miss unspoken cues or nuances in social situations, subtle shifts in tone. The literature frequently describes it almost like a cataract across our perception. It serves as a convenient explanation, maybe, for perceived deficits in language, social interactions, even cognitive flexibility. Essentially, it implies an inherent difficulty in grasping the unwritten rules that, well, neurotypical society values.
But here's where Horrocks introduces a core challenge, really flipping that narrative completely. She provocatively asks, what if the deficit is not ours? What if context blindness is a label for something else entirely? The banality, vagueness, and dishonesty of neurotypical communication itself. This isn't about an inability to perceive, rather it's reframed. Reframed as a refusal to play a rigged game of euphemism and subtext. It's a powerful idea. It suggests what we've labeled a deficit might actually be a very different kind of integrity.
So it's not just a lack of perception, but an active choice to prioritize directness. That's a profound reframe. What does the source say about the implications of this refusal for, daily autistic experience?
Exactly. It's presented as an unwillingness to dignify euphemism, innuendo, and performative small talk with the weight of truth. Unquote. This perspective argues that autistic people aren't blind to context, they just perhaps prefer clarity and take words at face value. It's framed as integrity in preferring directness, which is then often mislabeled as a deficit. It really makes us consider that perhaps the problem lies not in how autistic people perceive, but in what they're being asked to perceive.
And this reframing brings us to how this deficit story is often perpetuated, particularly in today's digital landscape, right? Hoerricks points out this market of pathology where autism coaches and branding guides, they churn out the same thin slogans dressed as revelation. These posts are formulaic, often algorithm-shaped, primarily designed to harvest clicks, to convert curiosity into cash, rather than, say, to open thought. Their business model, it's argued, relies on reinforcing the idea of autistic people as broken and neurotypicals as the measure, instead of challenging those foundational claims.
Right. That's a powerful critique of that whole industry.
But just to play devil's advocate for a moment, isn't some form of support or guidance necessary for individuals navigating a neurotypical world? Where's the line between genuine help and perpetuating this market of pathology?
That's a really crucial distinction, yeah. The critique isn't against all support, of course not. It's against approaches that pathologize natural autistic traits just to create a continuous need for intervention, often for profit. It suggests that if the solution always involves changing the autistic individual to fit neurotypical norms, without questioning the norms themselves, well, then it just reinforces the pathology narrative. The line, then, might be drawn at whether the intervention cultivates mutual understanding and accessibility, or if it simply demands one-way conformity.
Okay. It's clear then that the definitions of context blindness are heavily influenced by cultural biases. Let's explore the historical construction of this deficit a bit. Theories like weak central coherence, which is, the idea that autistic people tend to focus on details rather than the big picture, and context blindness, they didn't just appear out of thin air. They were, as the source states, built. They fundamentally rest on this assumption of a default human norm, a norm that's analytical, linear, always eager to smooth ambiguity into consensus. From there, anything that deviates from this assumed norm gets pathologized. It's sort of a circular logic, isn't it? Define normal, measure against it, then describe divergence as a deficit, without ever questioning the cultural biases baked into that definition of normal.
And what's truly fascinating here, and often ignored, is a key historical figure, Dr. Grunya Efimovna Sukhareva. Nearly 2 decades before Kanner and Asperger became the big names, Sukhareva was writing in Russian and German, with remarkable precision. Her descriptions of autistic children, keen observers, solitary inventors, musically gifted, sensitive to sound and smell, preferring fairy tales over communal play, showing flattened affect, intense interests, refusal to bend to it, they resonate profoundly with modern understanding. Crucially, though, her rigorous accounts were not weaponized as deficit. She acknowledged both the challenges and the unique strengths with a kind of gentleness often absent in later framings.
Right. So it makes you wonder why Sukhareva's, rigorous work was largely ignored by the mainstream historical narrative. The source directly addresses this. It says her work did not fit the eugenic economy of citation, unquote. It highlights that Asperger, described as a party physician in Nazi Vienna, wasn't likely to build his research on the words of a Jewish woman from the Soviet Union, end quote. The prevailing establishment, it seems, chose its founders carefully, effectively erasing her legacy from the canon for reasons that had nothing to do with scientific merit, but everything to do with the social and political biases of the time.
Exactly. And so the narrative that did survive was Kanner's early infantile autism and Asperger's division. His division into useful and unfit individuals. It was a framework that congealed around utility, productivity, and race hygiene. This focus on utility and pathology has regrettably persisted. Even in our own era, you see Simon Baron-Cohen's concept of mind blindness. It continues this tradition, pathologizing artistic life as a failure to access theory of mind, as if empathy is some kind of monopoly held only by the majority. It's a direct lineage, really, of framing difference as a fundamental flaw rather than just variation.
This idea of integrity in demanding clarity, especially in what can feel like a hostile system, it's really striking. It forces us to reconsider the power dynamics in everyday communication. The source argues that the real threat isn't autistic cognition itself, but the relentless demand to interpret unspoken cues in a hostile system. We're often expected to read subtext, nod along to euphemism, even when it might be deployed against us. And the insistence on clarity, on taking words at face value, is consistently cast as blindness. But the article provocatively suggests it may just be integrity. What happens when that kind of clarity challenges established hierarchies?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting, doesn't it?
Yeah. So it's clear the definitions and histories are loaded with bias.
Yeah.
But how does this play out in the actual science, the research that shapes our understanding? What happens when we really scrutinize the methods used to measure these ideas?
That's the core question, yeah. And what's fascinating, or maybe frustrating, is how these studies, time and again, seem to fall into similar traps. They often define context purely from a neurotypical viewpoint, right?
Yeah.
They bake those assumptions into their tests and then, predictably, find a deficit in autistic participants. Take, for instance, work by Vermeulen. The concept of weak central coherence gets reframed as a lack of intuitive use of context. But the critique here is that context is frequently defined as majority-coded pragmatics, things like subtext, euphemism, hierarchical politeness. So if the test is designed to reward decoding these veiled intents rather than actual comprehension of explicit content, autistic individuals will predictably underperform. And this brings us straight to the double empathy problem. If misattunement is common between neurotypes, why is only one party medicalized? It suggests the findings are more a clash of communicative economies than some singular deficit.
Okay, so the very design of these assessments can basically predetermine the outcome. How does that impact not just the findings, but the real-world support systems developed from that research?
Oh, it's a huge impact. Because it means the problem is always located within the autistic individual. It's never seen as a mismatch of communication styles. Think about studies on perspective taking, like Ishikawa et al. From 2018. If perspective taking privileges reading between the lines over saying what you mean, well, then autistic honesty will predictably look like underperformance. And even when the expected statistical link isn't strong, the deficit narrative often somehow survives the failure of its own preferred causal route. This can happen because of things like construct impurity, where tasks accidentally bundle politeness norms into what they claim is perspective taking. Or it could be unmodeled heterogeneity, meaning they fail to account for other crucial factors like alexithymia, difficulty recognizing emotions or sensory overload. The implication here is really powerful. If we were to reverse the vantage, if we asked neurotypical participants to track autistic relevant cues, like specific scripts or special interest metaphors, a matching deficit would likely be found, which supports the double empathy problem symmetry.
Right, right. And what about studies on things like visual attention? Does that same kind of bias show up there too?
Absolutely. Studies like those by Fletcher Watson or Smith and Milne, they've shown heightened attention to detail alongside reduced sensitivity to contextually relevant changes.
Uh-huh.
But again, the definition of relevance is absolutely key. If tasks prioritize scene gist or social centrality, they're encoding a majority salience map, basically what neurotypicals typically notice first. Autistic perception, however, often prefers things like regularity, anomaly, and rule consistency over status grafted onto the scene by convention.
Mm.
So hyper-attention to detail then isn't an absence of context. It's a commitment to a different contextual layer, structure, deviation, affordance.
Mm.
And critically, this detail-first processing can actually be a protective asset in tasks needing ecological validity, real-world application. Things like hazard detection in a busy environment or identifying contractual misdirection in bureaucratic text.
So what does this all mean when we look across these different studies? It feels like a really consistent pattern. The research defines context as the majority's unspoken rules, bakes those rules into the tasks, and the instrument will inevitably produce a deficit by design. Seems almost circular. But if you switch the lens, if you consider the double empathy problem and ecological validity, asking what meanings are truly at stake and whose context is being privileged, the findings become not a failure to see, but a refusal to collude with obfuscation. Not mind blindness, but a different ethics of attention. It really feels like it's time to flip the script then. To reframe these terms with intention and agency, the source offers this powerful new vocabulary that really challenges the old ways of thinking. It's amazing how simply changing the word can shift the entire meaning, can't it? Moving from a perceived deficit to maybe a conscious choice, a principle of respect. So instead of context blindness, it's really refusal, choosing not to play a rigged game.
Right.
They call it poor perspective taking, but maybe it's really honesty offering truth without the varnish. Failure to read the room becomes resistance. Refusing to collude with subtle hierarchies.
Yeah, a resistance.
What's labeled mind blindness is actually detail sight, catching inconsistencies others might miss.
A strength, not a weakness.
And literalism, that's clarity, say what you mean, as a principle of mutual respect.
Absolutely.
Even inflexibility gets reframed as sovereignty, the refusal to let go of coherence. And lack of social imagination is seen as narrative abundance.
This reframe is so crucial because it turns the gaze outward. The source posits that the blindness may not be ours at all. Instead, it suggests neurotypicals live with detail blindness, pattern blindness, honesty blindness. They often smooth over contradiction, ignore what doesn't flatter them, fail to see the structures that scaffold their own privilege. It truly asks us to consider who is really refusing to see what is plainly there.
And this brings us right to the politics of context, because when autistic difference is framed as a deficit, it immediately opens a lucrative corridor for interventions, doesn't it? This creates a massive market for therapies, training programs, and, as the source puts it, the massive empire of applied behavior analysis, ABA. The diagnosis itself seems to feed this market, justifying why autistic people must be taught, drilled, normalized.
Yes, and it's important to look at how ABA, for example, absorbs this concept, even implicitly. While it rarely speaks directly of context blindness, its logic is kind of embedded in techniques like discrimination training and natural environment teaching. What this often means is systematically modifying the environment, reinforcing only the behaviors that look appropriate in a given setting and extinguishing the ones that don't. As researchers Heflin and Alberto put it way back in 2001, these strategies mitigate context blindness indirectly, which, if you translate that, kind of means they punish our clarity until we perform the ambiguity expected of us.
Wow, that helps explain why so many autistic advocates say no to ABA. It's not just a question of method then, but of underlying politics, the core philosophy. ABA's elastic vagueness, as the source calls it, allows it to be branded as this universal fix for almost any perceived autistic trait, which creates an endless market for more sessions, programs, funding.
Meanwhile, what autistic people actually ask for are often things like accessibility, honesty, stability, clarity in environments, and communication. Yet, these needs do not generate the same revenue streams. It's a stark contrast. The source argues that capitalism, or at least certain industries, needs jargon, euphemism, layers of plausible deniability to keep the machine running. Therefore, artistic clarity becomes a threat precisely because it refuses to play the game on which entire industries depend.
So let's imagine stepping outside that old, often condescending vocabulary altogether for a moment. Instead of context blindness, maybe we should be thinking context refusal, context clarity, or even context sovereignty. These shifts feel so powerful because they emphasize agency and decision over perceived lack, suggesting autistic perception isn't broken sight, but maybe a disciplined vision.
And this reframing also highlights what the research so often leaves unsaid, doesn't it? None of the studies we've talked about truly acknowledge the double empathy problem in their limitation sections. The idea that communication difficulty might be shared. Instead, interventions are almost always one way. The burden of adaptation is placed solely on the autistic individual. The possibility that neurotypical people might need to learn autistic contexts, maybe learn to hear scripts as story, or read special interests as depth. That possibility is quietly erased to better serve institutional ends.
And yet, we get glimpses of what's truly possible when we move beyond those limitations. Despite all the cliches about autistic people being unfit for love or partnership, the source notes that autistic relationships often thrive. There's less performance, less double guessing, more room for clarity, and that clarity is described as sustaining. It shows that different communication styles can indeed be highly effective, deeply fulfilling, when mutual respect for those differences is present.
Which suggests that autistic ways of being, like insisting words mean what they say, building worlds out of story and detail, are not pathology. They're perhaps inheritance, Yishul. The enduring presence of autistic life across cultures and centuries suggests not fragility but advantage, a benefit misnamed as disorder. It really challenges us to see these traits not as something to be fixed, but as a valuable and persistent aspect of human diversity.
So, to wrap up our deep dive today, it feels pretty clear that autistic communication isn't necessarily deficit, but difference. It's another way of making meaning, one that actively resists the, maybe, worship of subtext and euphemism. The studies that label autistic people as blind seem to reveal less about autistic minds and maybe more about the culture doing the naming. They seem to measure a societal anxiety around hidden meanings, the fragility of hierarchies maintained through unspoken rules.
Exactly. And if you really flip the gaze, a different pathology emerges. It's not autistic clarity that looks brittle, but perhaps neurotypical dependence on obfuscation, the endless hedging, the reliance on double meanings, the fear of saying what one really thinks. These could, in a different world, be studied as impairment. Imagine what research would look like if it treated ambiguity as the symptom, not the cure. Imagine a literature on detail blindness, honesty aversion, maybe obfuscation disorder.
Maybe the problem isn't that autistic people are blind at all. Maybe, as the article provocatively states, we're just not that into you, or, more precisely, into the exhausting rituals of concealment that pass for normality. Clarity is respect, and resistance to ambiguity challenges power.
Autistic difference is not defect. It is survival, it is inheritance, it is vision.
So after today's deep dive, what stands out to you? What about the power dynamics embedded in how we define normal communication? We invite you to continue exploring that thought.